Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, police are now considering a terrorist motive for the shocking murder of Anne Widdecombe. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood is feuding with Pakistan over the deportation of a convicted child sex offender. And we will be building up to the semi-final on Wednesday by looking at the history of England versus Argentina, spanning a rivalry with plenty of beef. And finally, we weigh in on the big wealth tax debate between Dan Neidle and Gary Stephen, which has gone absolutely viral on Twitter this week. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Are you recovered from your quarterfinal viewing experience? Where were you?
I was in my friend's garden who set up a projector and had it on a bedsheet. But unlike you, who I think was suffering because of a bad screen, I could actually see the match, could see where the ball was, and I think it was a lucky result.
I could see the match.
That came from quality of play.
You just had to look for the ball. And it was an inflatable screen, sort of a kind of pop-up. A couple of hundred people there in Leighton. But they'd sort of bought an inflatable screen, I think, from like Amazon. So like the side, what was holding the sheet up was inflatable, which meant that you could never tell if anything was offside because the screen was kind of waving. Probably better than VAR, eh? Hey. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You could also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And do let us know what you think in the comments. And I should just say apologies. We're slightly late this evening. We had actually done the first 8 minutes of the show before realizing there was a technical problem, which meant that we hadn't gone live. So don't worry. If you were thinking, why aren't they bloody getting to work on time? You just couldn't see it.
It meant that, like always, I was pretending to laugh at your jokes. The first time out of politeness and the second time out of necessity.
Yep. That's all I ask of you. Let's go straight into that first story. Counter-terrorism police have taken over the investigation into the murder of former Conservative MP and Reform spokesperson Anne Widdecombe. Now, that is a shift from the original stated position of Devon and Cornwall police that there was no reason to believe there was a political motivation to the attack. Today, police said they had obtained new information in what they call, quote, a dynamic and complex investigation. A 28-year-old man from Rotherham in South Yorkshire was arrested on suspicion of murder on Saturday, and he's now been rearrested for terror offences. Reform members and others on the right had been widely criticised for engaging in speculation around Widdecombe's murder, and they were sort of quick to claim they were vindicated today. So Reform MP Richard Tice said this on X. A lot of journalists must now apologise to Nigel and us at Reform. You know who you are. Now, the context there is the police had said, we don't want anyone to speculate. Lots of Reform politicians then did speculate on motives. But their speculation often involved saying, look, this is a high-profile politician. Why have they been so quick to sort of dismiss the idea that it could be politically motivated? The fact that it's now a terrorism investigation or the counter-terrorism police are in charge of it seems like maybe actually there was a political motivation. Whether or not you think that speculation was wise, up for debate. In footage obtained by the Sun newspaper, the suspect can be seen on a Ring doorbell camera getting into his car early on the morning of Widdecombe's murder with a large object in his shorts pocket. He is then reported to have driven nearly 270 miles to Widdecombe's home in Devon. Now, Anne Widdecombe led what is probably best described as a controversial and colourful career. A Tory MP for 23 years, she later became a Brexit Party member of the European Parliament and then a Reform spokesperson in 2023. Long one of the Tories' most prominent Eurosceptics, she was also an arch social conservative who opposed abortion and fought hard for years against the introduction of equal rights for the LGBTQ community. She also pushed for the reintroduction of the death penalty. But in an improbable second act, she found a later career as a sort of aunt-like figure, an entertainer. She appeared on programmes such as Have I Got News for You, Celebrity Big Brother, The Chase, and hosted a quiz show on Sky. And she was memorably whipped around the floor like a mop on Strictly Come Dancing. Here's her dance partner, Anton Dubake, recalling the moment.
My fondest memories of dancing at Blackpool on Strictly Come Dancing, the Anne Widdecombe samba. People on the street waiting outside could hear the screams from the ballroom as I did the famous bum spin. That's basically my Strictly Come Dancing life right there.
So yes, one of the more unusual trajectories in British public life. And now her death becomes the subject of a counter-terrorism Investigation. Ash, I suppose, so it did seem a bit odd when I first heard about the murder, I was thinking maybe this was a robbery gone wrong or something. I've met Anne Widdecombe a few times. I always got on with her, actually, on Channel 5. And she gave me the kind of idea that if she was being robbed, she might be like, and they were like, don't resist. I could just imagine her saying, like, I am a 79-year-old woman. I'm not going to stand here and let you rob my house. So I sort of I could imagine that scenario. But it does seem the case that the suspect drove hundreds of miles to get to her house, which, means that it wasn't presumably a robbery. And now the counter-terrorism police are involved, which means that potentially there is a political motivation. And obviously, in this country, there have been a reasonable number of political murders over the past decade or so. So this is going to have people very much sort of shocked and concerned.
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that there isn't a lot of information that's in the public domain, but what neighbours have said is that the suspect, who is currently in custody, may have had some learning difficulties, may have had mental health issues which were exacerbated by the loss of a parent late last year. And we also know that since he's been rearrested on suspicion of terror offences, the police are working from the theory that there is some kind of ideological motivation. Now, we don't know what that ideological motivation is. We don't know if it's religious motivation. We don't know if they're right-wing. We don't know if they're left-wing. What we can say for certain is the way in which discursively it's playing out on social media from right-wing journalists and commentators and those sort of around reform is that they want to turn it into a conversation about left-wing incivility on Twitter and to draw a sort of connection between callousness online and violence in real life. And I actually think that there is something else that needs to be considered here, is that to speak on a generalizable point, and so this isn't a comment on the suspect who's in custody, is that two things I think have combined with devastating effect in this country. One is the complete shambles that is care in the community mental health. Our mental health system is in complete disarray. And this model of care in the community, whether it's people like Valdo Calacane or Axel Rudikabana, who, fascinated with violence, pose a really, really clear risk to society, not being separated from society for the safety of everyone else, or whether it's people with much less severe or less of a risk of violence, simply not getting the kind of care that they might need. We know that there is a mental health crisis in the UK. And there is also, I think, a problem of digital immersion. So if you are online and you've got any kind of public profile, you'll know that people can become fixated on you. And I know this because it happens to me, is that there are people out there who develop a sort of fantasy life which involves you. And that fantasy life can be sexual, and that fantasy life can be racist, that fantasy life can be violent. And you've got no control over that whatsoever. And there is no way for you to know if or when that sort of rumination will cross over from sort of, existing in someone's head and playing out in their online life to something that they'll then act on in real life. And so I don't want to, I know everyone's saying I don't want to speculate and then immediately start speculating. But I think it's just as possible that this guy, if he was politically motivated, it's just as possible that he could have been to the right of reform as it is that he could be to the left of reform. And I do think that there is this puzzle piece here about fixation and about how digital immersion makes worse those problems of fixation, especially when you think about the sort of cuts to mental health services and the sort of social abandonment that's taken place under the guise of care in the community.
I mean, I always find it difficult when people, because if a right-wing person gets killed, then everyone says, you've got to separate this extreme action from sort of like civility discourse and the politics and stuff. But when a left-wing person gets killed, everyone... Well, the word exploit is too loaded, isn't it? But everyone takes a political message from a murder on their side. Yeah, basically.
I think it's impossible. It's impossible not to. And I would say that if Anne Widdecombe was the target for, harassment, abuse, violent threats, from the left regularly, and I'm not just talking about sort of like, accounts which might be run by bots, but I'm talking about like, actual people. I'd be like, oh, okay, that is something that's worth considering. I don't know whether that's the case or not. I mean, some of those responses that followed her death, I thought they did cross the line from sort of dark humor and shit posting, which is whether you like it or not, or whether you participate in it or not. That's part of the vernacular of the internet. I think some of it crossed over into something which I thought was just because you're politically left wing and just because her positions, many of them, I found them to be reactionary and abhorrent, it doesn't mean that it's morally permissible for you to sort of fantasize about how painful it might have been in her dying moments. Like, I don't think that's right.
I mean, also there's definitely a difference between like a natural death and a violent death when it comes to like the appropriateness of dark humor, right?
Yes, but I would also say like many people, I think, did that thing of like, shitposting gleefully when they thought it was a natural death. And I think even some of those, I think, cross that line from sort of dark humor into something else. And I would like to say that if I died of cancer and someone was like, well, I hope it really hurt her, you'd be like, that's not a nice thing to say.
100%. I would never say that.
Out
Dead
loud.
or alive. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood will this evening set out a plan to deport the recently freed ringleader of a Rochdale-based grooming gang. But to do that, she will have to make changes to the law. So Shabir Ahmed was jailed for 22 years in 2012 for multiple counts of rape and sexual abuse against children. But the 73-year-old was released from prison on license earlier this month. Now, several of Ahmed's victims say they have been terrified since he was freed. One victim, identified only as Ruby, told the media the following. So she said, "I'm scared for my safety and my kids' safety. The main ringleader is getting out of prison, who is well known in Rochdale, Oldham and Middleton. So even if he's not in that area, he still knows people and has a chance to talk to people from that area. And that makes me unsafe." So the idea of him not being in that area, as far as I understand, he will be released or has been released sort of on the basis that he can't go into Rochdale. But this person who was a victim of his sort of saying that doesn't mean he's not going to have any connections to the place where I presume she lives. Ruby also called for a change in the law to allow for Ahmed's deportation. So she's supporting what Shabana Mahmood is suggesting. Sarah Robotham, a former council worker and whistleblower who exposed the paedophile ring, told The Guardian this: "He has been on my mind ever since I heard that he was not going to be deported as promised. I am genuinely concerned that I will see him walk out of a local bail hostel near my house. If I feel like that, think how the woman he abused must feel." Ahmed, who came to the UK more than 50 years ago, held both British and Pakistani citizenship, but he was stripped of his British citizenship after his conviction, leaving him with only his Pakistani nationality. And the complication is that he cannot currently be deported due to a 1971 law that forbids the removal of Commonwealth citizens who arrived in the UK before 1973. That's why Mahmood is planning to amend the law, although it's not yet clear what changes she plans to make. There's also another issue. The BBC has reported, citing senior government officials, that Pakistan is going to refuse to accept Ahmed's deportation. They don't want this guy back who hasn't lived in Pakistan for 50 years. Victims Minister Catherine Atkinson was put under pressure on this point by BBC's Nick Robinson earlier today.
You accept that if you cannot get Pakistan to take this man back, this is a mere gesture giving false hope to victims, isn't it?
Well, it's quite clear this government doesn't want Shabir Ahmed in our country. He is a vile predator.
What you want and what will actually happen isn't really the point, isn't it? Just, if you would, address the point that we've just heard, that Pakistan will not take this man back. Well,
I understand that the Home Secretary will be having more to announce on this later today. But
more about the negotiations with Pakistan?
She has been absolutely clear that this government will take action to see Shabir Ahmed removed. And we've seen the success that she has had when it comes to removals in previous cases.
Now, on the same programme, Dr. Fazana Sheikh, an expert on Pakistan at the Chatham House think tank, said she understood Pakistan was demanding the extradition of 2 political dissidents before it would accept Ahmed. So they will take this guy if you extradite 2 Pakistani dissidents who are currently in the UK, which, I mean, would be a terrible thing to do. Mahmood, though, has suggested there might be other levers at her disposal. So in the past, when countries haven't taken back their citizens, she has said, well, then we won't give visas to sort of people from your country in the future, and that's tended to work. Obviously, I don't think it's been the case where they've been a British citizen who's been here for 50 years. Whatever deal can be made, our next Prime Minister has suggested that he's definitely sort of feels strongly that this guy should get out or should be deported. Andy Burnham said, I think a couple of weeks ago, like everyone, I want this vile criminal out of the country. Victims must come first. I will ask the Home and Foreign Secretaries to review all possible options, and they should consider nothing is off the table. Ash, very unpleasant story on all counts. I think some context here, which is important, is that this guy was actually sentenced to two sort of, under two convictions, and he was allowed to serve them contemporaneously at the same time. And my sense is that partly because the judge, when he'd been sentenced, said he would be deported as soon as he's let out of prison. So the judge was mistaken because the judge didn't know about the law, but his victims heard from the judge that this guy would never be released in Britain again, and now he's being released in Britain. So they're rightly pissed off. At the same time, sort of having a diplomatic sort of incident with Pakistan over this 73-year-old guy who's been here for 50 years seems a bit strange. And obviously stripping people of British citizenship, whatever they've done, is highly controversial. Ash, on this hot potato, I'm going to go to you.
I mean, look, so I suppose the first thing to say is that I can totally see it from the victim's point of view, which is if you still live in the Rochdale area, there is a non-zero chance that you might encounter him again. And I can completely see why, if you are a victim of the kind of child sexual exploitation that the police turned a blind eye to for so many years, and in fact demonized so many of the victims and treated them as though they were at fault for the abuse that they're experiencing, I can completely see how you have no faith in the authorities to keep you safe when this man is on the streets. I can completely see how you come to that position from an honestly held place. The problem, however, with what Andy Burnham is saying in terms of where you have to put victims first is that I think it's a dangerous thing to try and amend law on the basis of a single egregious case. I just think that that is a dangerous thing to do. This law, which prevents the deportation of people who arrived before 1973, that's what protects the status of Windrush citizens. We obviously know what happened under the prime ministership of Theresa May, and also when she was Home Secretary, in terms of the wrongful deportation, and also barring from access to public services of Windrush citizens. That's a really important law to protect. And I also think that there is a point of principle here, which is, do I think that this is a man who I want to have in this country? No. But why is he more Pakistan's problem than ours? Simply because that's where he was born. Like, this is where he spent the vast majority of his adult life. This is where he committed his offences. This is the place where police turned a blind eye. Why is it that we should put Pakistani girls at risk by deporting him to a country which is likely to have worse offender monitoring than ours, because we go, well, we just don't want him here. And so I think that there is obviously a principle of, what is a fair punishment system? I think a fair punishment system is where you get punished the same way, right? And not where some people get stripped of their citizenship on the basis of having dual nationality and other paedophiles and child sex offenders are able to walk free. I don't think that's a fair system. But I also don't think that it's right to say, well, you are some other country's problem now. It's going to be, girls in the global south, we're going to put them at risk because we actually don't care. So while I can completely see, like I said, from the perspective of the victims, of why you'd go, I do not want him anywhere near me. I do not want any risk of encountering him ever again. And I think if I were a victim, I would probably feel that exact same way. I think that trying to design a system which achieves that and only that goal is basically impossible. And what you're going to do is create something of a dragnet, which brings in all sorts of other cases in a way which is kind of messed up.
I mean, he should have just been put in prison for a much longer period of time.
So he was initially sentenced to 22 years, and I think that he first went inside in 2012.
Yeah. So he's been in for 14 years, and but as I say, I think the judge allowed I haven't looked at it in detail, but from sort of a couple of interviews I've been listening to, my impression was that the judge, because obviously the prisons are full, so they're like, well, we'll give him a short sentence, then send him off to Pakistan. It's sort of like that will keep him off the streets, which obviously I agree with you. He should have just gone to prison for a much longer time. This Wednesday, England will face Argentina in the World Cup semi-final. The two countries have a rich footballing rivalry. In 1966, Argentina's captain, Antonio Ratin, was sent off and refused to leave the pitch for several minutes. England manager Alf Ramsey afterwards called the Argentines, quote, animals, an insult the team and its fans have never forgotten. Then at the 1986 World Cup, Argentina beat England in the quarterfinals, in part thanks to Maradona's hand of God, where he scored with a handball unseen by the referee. The match I remember was at the 1998 World Cup, where David Beckham was sent off and we lost on penalties. However, the rivalry is about more than just football. So those were the scenes in the Argentine changing room after they beat Switzerland to win a place in Wednesday's semi-finals. And the chant goes, I want to see the fourth star sparkling on the jersey, so the fourth World Cup they would have won. I'm Argentine from the cradle to the grave. For the Malvinas, and for Diego Maradona, and for Leo's last World Cup, that's obviously Messi. Oh, Argentina, I want to see you world champions for the second time in a row. So you got Maradona, Messi, the Malvinas. What are the Malvinas? Well, to a Brit and to the residents, actually, of the islands. The Malvinas are the Falklands Islands. And the Falklands are a British overseas territory, 300 miles off the coast of Argentina, which has been settled by Europeans since the 1600s. There wasn't anyone there to begin with, as far as we know. At various times, the islands have had French, British, Spanish, and Argentine settlements. Britain asserted its rule of the island in 1833, but it has been subject to an ongoing dispute, with Argentina also claiming sovereignty.
It would appear the sun has set on yet another corner of the British Empire, this one far down in the South Atlantic. Argentina today invaded and seized the Falkland Islands, which have been under British rule for nearly 150 years. Britain promptly broke diplomatic relations with Argentina, sent several of Her Majesty's warships steaming south, and appealed to the United Nations. It all seems like something out of the 18th century, but the British, and for that matter, the Americans, are not amused.
So that was a news report from 1982, just after the invasion of the Falklands by the military dictatorship then in charge of Argentina. They'd invaded the islands on the basis that the British would not defend an uneconomic outpost 8,000 miles away. But the Argentinian government had misjudged. Britain sent a naval task force to reclaim the island. And after a 10-week war, which left 649 Argentine and 255 British military personnel dead, along with 3 islanders, Britain retook the Falklands. And the big winner was this woman.
Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the white ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen.
What happens next?
Thank you very much.
What's your reaction,
Just rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
Are we going to declare war on?
So Margaret Thatcher had been languishing in the polls amid high unemployment and inflation, but victory in that war saw her support soar. And in 1983, she rejoiced when she won an increased majority. Meanwhile, in Argentina, lost in the war brought forward the demise of the military junta and a transition to democracy. Ash, my question for you. We're both feeling rather patriotic today, aren't we? Come Wednesday, will you be cheering not just for Bellingham and Kane, but for the Falklands?
The Falklands haven't really been on my mind. I can't lie. They haven't really been on my mind here. I mean, we discussed this a little bit before we went live. And actually, when it comes to, who are the rightful possessors of the Falkland Islands, I think it's up to the people who live on the Falkland Islands. And I don't know why, but those mad bastards really want to be British. So that means I think they should remain a British overseas territory. And for me, that's the principle that I make the decision based on, right? The principle of self-determination. I do think there's an interesting question here, though, and really it's about the culture of football. And it's to what extent do you fold, historical and I suppose sometimes jingoistic themes into football rivalry. And I think that's always been a part of football culture, but it's interesting to me that particularly in England, that's something that the FA have tried to get rid of a bit. So you're not allowed to sing 10 German bombers anymore.
Because also, I always remember 1 World Cup, 2 World Wars from when I was young, but that doesn't get chanted anymore as far as I can tell.
I chant it.
You chant it, okay.
I chant it, but it's the sort of thing which is very much frowned upon. And so something which happened during this World Cup is, of course, the Norwegians had the row. And you had these right-wing commentators on X saying things like, well, they can celebrate their colonialism, why can't we? And I would suppose that the rule of thumb here is that you have to consider a few things all at once. Morality. Now, I don't think that the Vikings were hugely moral colonizers, right? Neither were the English. So you're not going to win out on morality. How much time has elapsed? Obviously, Viking conquest of Europe is a lot further away than British colonialism or American chattel slavery. And also, I suppose, what kind of continuing impact it has on today's society. So I'd say on morality, but in terms of time gone by and continuing impact on today's society, the Viking conquest is a lot less noxious than British colonialism. But I don't think there should be this hard and fast rule of saying, well, you have to get rid of all of it. I mean, if international football is an expression of national identity, which it is, you are going to have elements of your national story folded into it. So I think that we should be able to sing 10 German bombers and 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup. I'm not going to be chanting about the Falklands unless I get super duper drunk, and then we'll see what I do.
I don't think there is a Falklands War chant, is there? Maybe we had one in the 80s. I've never heard one.
I mean, a friend of mine who was really drunk on Saturday night when it was clear that we'd be facing Argentina punched the air and said, "Sink the Belgrano." So some people
Ooh, that one is controversial because that's
that's basically a war crime.
So we should talk about this because I think lots of people will look at the Malvinas or the Falklands Island or whatever and say, this island is clearly right next to Argentina, right? Why the hell is it British? And there is obviously like a strong logic to that. And I'm definitely not passionate about Britain keeping the Falklands. But it's also not obvious why it should be Argentina's, because this isn't really a colonial thing. Like, Argentina is a settler colony. And there were people there. So if you've got a problem with sort of settler colonies, theirs is more problematic than the Falklands, because the Falklands was empty. And the people on the Falklands, about 3,000 of them, really want to remain part of the. So they're an overseas territory, which means they're self-governing, but their foreign policy is sort of absorbed into ours. So it's Britain's responsibility to defend them. And actually, this is another one of those examples where Britain tried to give it away. So in the 60s and the 70s, the British government thought that having this island was costly, and also it was screwing up their ability to trade with South American countries because there was this dispute. So they tried to give it to Argentina, but the people there really kicked up a fuss. Obviously, you might think, why can't we just stuff these 3,000 people's mouths with gold and they can come back to Britain or, go live in southern Spain or wherever. But they didn't want to do that. And so we did this war. And it's the Belgravia or the Belgrano. The Belgrano, that's the really controversial bit about the war, which is that Britain bombed a warship which was already sailing back to Argentina from the Malvinas. So that's the one where I think probably the most sort of middle of the road argument is to say defending the Falklands was fine if expensive, but bombing the Belgrano was bad.
Was a war crime. Look, I just sort of think that there are some people, and there are some people in this country who I think in the spirit of anti-colonialism will insist that the Falklands are the Malvinas, right? And Gary Lineker did. That's where I draw the line on my... Yeah.
So Gary Lineker is woker than Ash Sarkar.
Yeah, Gary Lineker is woker than me in this regard. I'm like, it's the Falklands, mate. I'm sorry.
Because the people who live there call it the Falklands. The Argentinians have no real claim to it beyond it being close. So, F Argentina. Let's get to the final. Come on, boys. No, I am fine with the Argentinians, but I do hope we win. There's obviously lots of corruption going on where VAR is constantly helping the Argentinian team. So I think it would be...
The conspiracy theory that I believe is that FIFA are doing everything in their power to engineer an Argentina versus France final. That's the conspiracy theory that I believe. And so I'm gonna say this, which is Declan Rice, I don't like you and you don't like me. But if you have to snap someone's ACL, do it this Wednesday.
What's an ACL?
Anterior cruciate ligament.
Oh, that's mean.
Yeah.
Okay, I might.
How's that worse than anything that anyone else has been saying?
I might say F the Argentines, but I'm not going to promote violence against someone's muscles.
No, not violence, just a reckless tackle.
Okay, let's go on to our next story. I don't really believe F the Argentines for any Argentines watching, or for anyone who just doesn't think that you should say F to any national identity, which I also believe. I'm a very liberal, open-minded, universalist guy.
Let's move on, man. I think the story's played out.
Andy Burnham has a major task on his hands, winning back those who've abandoned Labour because they think it's too right-wing and keeping enough reform-curious voters to win a majority. And for that former group, there is no more important issue than Gaza. So it was no surprise when last week the Prime Minister in waiting posted this video on social media.
The response has too often not been good enough. We need to do better. Yes, we have taken some important steps. These include recognising the Palestinian state, placing sanctions on Israeli ministers and imposing waves of sanctions on violent settlers and the organisations that support them. I also fully support the restrictions on arms licences to make sure that no British bombs or bullets can be used by the IDF in Gaza or in the West Bank. We need to do more, which includes looking at further sanctions, both on those involved in the violence in Gaza, but also looking at measures to ban trade in goods with illegal settlements. I, like many people, feel passionately about Gaza, and I will do everything I can to work with international partners to stop the suffering, to ensure the Israeli government adheres to international law, and to keep the prospect of a two-state solution alive, because this is the only way to lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians.
And so the video came with the caption, quote, Labour's initial response to the treatment of Gaza caused huge hurt. We got it wrong, and I am sorry for that. So sort of Andy Burnham then got lots of headlines. The Guardian sort of had it, sort of the main story, you know, Andy Burnham apologises for Labour's response to Gaza, which was presumably the headline he wanted. Ash, I mean, there's not much concrete here, is there? So lots of people saying he hasn't called it a genocide. To be honest, I didn't expect him to call it a genocide. But also it's saying suspected war crimes. And also, I think the main disappointing thing is there's not really any outline of any concrete actions. Like if he were to stand up and say, us being party to sort of any exports of arms to Israel was a disgrace and I'm going to put an end to it, I would say it doesn't matter if he calls it a genocide. If he's done that, that's the concrete thing, but he hasn't.
But look, I suppose the thing that I'm going to try and do is say this is probably what he's thinking. I don't think Andy Burnham has in his head what is a just response to Labour's prior positioning when it comes to the genocide and what position the government should take now. I think what he's thinking is how do I neutralise this as best as I can as an issue which has been responsible for driving away progressive voters from Labour into the arms of, for instance, the Green Party. And so you need to see this as him trying to take a tack where he's trying to say, I'm different from Keir Starmer, but I'm not going to do anything which drives up the salience of Gaza as an issue. So if he does something which would be actually materially meaningful, so going from appearing to commit war crimes to war crimes have taken place, right? Because that then means there are certain legal obligations on the part of the UK. Or something like it's a genocide, which then, of course, activates our obligations under the Genocide Convention. Or if he's going to talk about South Africa's case at the ICJ, or if he's talking about, much more extensive measures, for instance, the trading relationship with the Israeli state, or, name any one of these things, is that those are all things that obviously I would agree with and you would agree with. And I think many of those progressive voters who abandoned Labour would agree with. But from Andy Burnham's perspective, as someone who I don't think is particularly interested in foreign policy and wants to have a relentless focus on domestic policy, he goes, well, that means that I'm starting to get some downside. So this is how you end up in a place where I'd say, yes, there is clearly a rhetorical shift here, but that's not being met by any kind of material action. The thing that I would maybe suggest, and, I don't think that me or you, and indeed many of our viewers on Novara Media, are necessarily typical voters, right? Like, we're highly politically motivated people, and the substance of the issue and not just the vibe clearly matters a lot, right? That's something which is really clear about our audience, and I think it's really clear from our coverage as well. I think that of those many, many, many progressive voters who left Labour for the Greens between 2024 and now, there is going to be a substantive chunk of them who are worried about reform and are going to be looking for a way back. And so there is a huge test coming up for Zach Polanski's Green Party, which is whether Andy Burnham's shift in rhetoric is the sort of permission slip, maybe, that some of those voters need to come back to Labour, because the thing that they're actually really worried about is reform. And I know that there are lots of people on the left who disagree with me about this, but I think it's the left's happy place to go, Andy Burnham is just continuity Starmer, right? If Andy Burnham is continuity Starmer, the strategy for Zach Polanski is actually really easy. It's just continue doing what you are already doing, right? He's clearly been very, very effective at punishing Keir Starmer for his political missteps and for his, gleeful embrace of right-wing politics. The challenge for Zach Polanski is, what if Andy Burnham follows through on some of the things that he's saying, right? The Greens, if they solely focus on Gaza or solely focus on immigration, because we know that materially those things are unlikely to change a huge deal. Those are matters which are really important. They're important matters of principle. I think that they're really important moral tests, but they're not a majoritarian project. They're not something which, the bulk of voters in this country, whether progressive or not, are likely to change their votes based on, right? Particularly with the threat of reform. So I think that this video, it doesn't necessarily signal a material shift from Labour under Andy Burnham. But what it does do is that I think that it spells out what the challenge is to Zach Polanski, which is that Andy Burnham is clearly working hard on squeezing the Greens. And Zach Polanski's got to think about what is a majoritarian project that the Greens can go for and present, and not just thinking about what are these individual weaknesses of Burnham, which, while important, don't necessarily speak to the median voter.
Yeah, and I mean, there's two. So with Burnham on Gaza, there's two things going on, right? Which is that, one, he wants to win back Green voters and sort of Muslim voters who've abandoned Labour, because there are actually quite a lot of people who are very politically engaged on this issue who aren't necessarily like the usual suspect Novara Media supporters, because there's also like a big network within mosques and the like who are very focused on this.
And they're also worried about reform.
Yeah, that's true. But who might not be appeased by sort of like a video. Because they might be high information voters in the sense that they're sort of like very, very engaged in politics. So I think he should go much further, right? I think electorally he should like put sanctions on Israel, because there is no one in the country who likes. I mean, there are obviously a small amount of people in the country who likes Israel, but the vast majority. It's not like reform voters love Israel, right? What they don't want is a political party who seems obsessed with Israel, because I think a criticism of the left that sort of large swathes of the population have is that it's too obsessed with faraway conflicts. But I don't think there's anyone who would say like, oh, the left, they're too mean about Israel, because no one really likes it.
I mean, look, the people who say that are exclusively work in British print media, and like, fine, like, fuck them. And I agree with you that Andy Burnham has room to go further. And I suppose the thing which I find most interesting, as someone who's like really aware of the sort of changing political composition of our audience, is what does this mean for the Greens? Because I do think that majoritarian space is being closed down for Zach Polanski. And it's probably quite good that he seems to have just withdrawn a little bit, and he's clearly taking stock and thinking about what to do next, rather than barreling in and just going, okay, well,
this guy's the same.
Yeah.
He's tricking you, yeah. He does seem to be taking it more carefully. Let's look at someone who, or some groups who think that actually Andy Burnham's gone too far. So obviously, as we said, Burnham's remarks have been criticised as too timid by many. He's refused to call Israel's actions a genocide, said it was up to the courts to decide whether war crimes had been committed. Few concrete measures outlined. It was still too much, though, for the Jewish Leadership Council and the Board of Deputies. So they issued this statement. So they said, "We have been in touch with Andy Burnham's team to convey directly our significant concerns in relation to his remarks yesterday. We welcome his zero-tolerance approach to anti-Semitism, affirm his assertion that there is no contradiction between fighting anti-Semitism and disagreeing with the actions of the Israeli government, and share concern for the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. However, anti-Semitism cannot be confronted without addressing all its drivers. In today's Britain, this includes Islamist far-left and far-right extremists who go beyond criticism of the Israeli government to a place of hatred directed at Jews and Israelis. These voices build on distorted or one-sided portrayals of the situation in Gaza and its causes, and ceaseless attempts to single out the world's only Jewish state." Ash, I suppose there's a number of routes we could go down here, but so linking to my last point, which is that electorally, I think you should go very hard on this. There's also going to be a lot of people saying, don't.
Well,
and it'll be sort of groups like the Board of Deputies, but also like James Pennell, who's just his chief of staff, who before has been chair of Labour Friends of Israel. There's going to be lots of people who are sort of claiming, oh, it would be dangerous for you electorally if you go too tough on Israel, when really they mean we're actually, to some degree, part of the Israel lobby.
Yeah, I mean, look, what this is from the Board of Deputies is pure cakeism, right? Pure cakeism. It is, at once we want to hold that is anti-Semitic to conflate British Jews with the state of Israel, which I and you also believe it is anti-Semitic to do that, whilst also at the same time relentlessly invoking our status as the representative of British Jewish communities, and also the safety of British Jews when we are running interference for Israel, when we are in some way representing the political interests of the Israeli state. And the thing is that I do think that, and I've said this before, that this is something which is going to harden hearts towards anti-Semitism rather than make people take it more seriously, because like, we're not idiots. Like, if you have watched the news at any point in the last 3 years, you will see children with limbs being torn to shreds, civilians being fired upon when they're queuing for aid, people forced into destitution and starvation because of the IDF's blockade. And then you've got these advocates for Israel saying, well, it's anti-Semitic if you point any of that out. And rather than making people think, oh, well, actually, it's really important to listen to the experiences of Jewish people, which of course it is, it's making people feel the opposite, which is, you're full of shit, right? You're talking about anti-Semitism when I don't see anything anti-Semitic going on here. I'm just talking about facts about what the Israeli state is doing. And I think that there is a short-sightedness to this. And this is something which Daniel Levy pointed out when I interviewed him most recently on Downstreams, that there is a short-sightedness to this, which in this conflation, right, and what you would call a sort of pro-Israel, Zionist conflation between Jews in the diaspora and the state of Israel, is that all that's doing is weakening the bonds of community and belonging between Jewish people in the diaspora and everyone else in society. It's insisting on the state of separateness. 2, it's fundamentally irreconcilable with anti-racism, because it says that the solution to anti-Semitism, to racism, is to go to a different country, right? To go to Israel. And then there's this third thing, which is you end up in this horrible boy who cried wolf scenario, which is if 9 times out of 10 you're hearing anti-Semitism being invoked, and it's bullshit, right? It is a naked attempt to close down the space in which the Israeli state can be held accountable, then that 1 time out of 10 where it's not bullshit, people are not going to listen. So horribly short-sighted. Board of Deputies of British Jews, I know that they're probably going to accuse me of goy-splaining or some such, but I don't think they're doing a very good job of actually representing their community's interests. Doing an excellent job of representing Israel's interests, however. Can't fault them.
I mean, hopefully, the thing is, Burnham doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who's going to call out the Board of Deputies, because he wants to be liked by everyone, which makes it seem like he is going to go down the middle of the road, not really change very much when it comes to this particular policy, because it's too spiky. And also, it's not his, in the video when he says, I care deeply about Gaza, like, I'm sure he's a nice guy, so he doesn't like seeing, pictures of maimed children. But I have never got the impression that he's like really obsessed with international policy, which means that he might be quite easy to be pushed around. Gary Stevenson has a blockbuster new interview with Aaron Bastani, which is going gangbusters on our YouTube channel. But it's his documentary with Channel 4 that has been fueling a greater amount of online discourse. And that discourse is particularly focused on a debate that Gary had with tax expert Dan Neidle. Samuel Leeds, a landlord influencer. We've discussed him before on this show. He featured in Gary's documentary, tweeted this. Gary's economics has just ruined its credibility and proven that it clearly knows very little about economics. The absolute tax legend, Dan Neidle, destroyed Gary in his own documentary. The very documentary, just a compilation of Gary being proven wrong time and time again about his solution to economic inequality. Let me know if you've watched it. The Dan Neidle debate has got to be one of the best moments in the show. Now, that tweet and the attached video, which we're going to show you some in a moment, has clocked up 3 million views. And Samuel Leeds has had some establishment backup for his interpretation as well. So John Stepek is a reporter at Bloomberg and executive editor of Money Week. So he said, I find this fascinating. This is about that clip that was shared. I mean, kudos for allowing it to go out. I'm assuming Stevenson had some editorial control, but I'm not sure what he was trying to achieve here. The centre-left Guardian has also sort of put out the idea that Gary had just completely lost this argument. So the Guardian gave the Channel 4 documentary 2 stars, calling it an embarrassment. Reviewers said that the show allowed its host, so that's Gary Stevenson, to be totally out-argued by all his interviewees. So that was a quote, that was their interpretation. So what's in this damning exchange between Gary and Dan Neidle, which we're told completely discredits Gary Stevenson and his claims to know anything whatsoever about economics. Well, this is the part of the show that Samuel Leeds shared.
So my proposal is a 2% tax on wealth of above £10 million.
Absolute populist claptrap, and the people pushing this should be ashamed of themselves. If the Chancellor stood up and said, we're going to have a wealth tax, we're going to have 2% on all wealth over 10 million, it would require, let's be generous, like a year of planning at least. Yeah. You then need to build the systems. You need to tax 20,000 people. You're not going to raise any revenue from a wealth tax before 2029. You could be in favour of a wealth tax, but anyone claiming that it's an answer is deluded. Well, the Wealth Tax Commission did a huge amount of work on the wealth tax, more than anyone else in the world, maybe more than everyone else put together. They concluded an annual wealth tax is a non-starter. And that was as a result of the work that they did.
What they concluded?
That's what the report says.
What I saw was that they proposed that for revenue raising, a one-off wealth tax they preferred, but they said explicitly in the paper, if you are worried about inequality, that will not be enough. And if you're worried about inequality, you probably won't look at annual wealth tax. That's what was in the report.
Well, it wasn't that strong. The foreword said, and I quote exactly, you can get, but the foreword said exactly that it's a non-starter for the UK.
There are limits to the extent of redistribution that can be achieved using existing tax on wealth, even after effective reforms. An annual wealth tax could be justified on this conditional basis.
That's pretty weak.
Is that saying it's a non-starter?
The foreword says an annual wealth tax is a non-starter.
It's a very strange clip because he's saying that report, and Dan Neidle is saying, this is the most sort of rigorous report that's ever been done on a wealth tax, says that it's a non-starter. And then Gary reads him a quote which says, if what you want to do is reduce inequality, then an annual wealth tax might well be justified. And then he says, well, that's a bit weak, isn't it? To me, it looks like Gary has kind of contradicted him. Also, the objection that it would take more than a year. Dan Neidle was a big advocate for a land value tax. I think there's very good arguments for a land value tax, by the way. I'm very much in favour. The argument for a land value tax over a property tax is that, as Dan Neidle says, if you tax something, you do tend to get less of it. But you can't, less wealth, sort of less investment would be bad. Less land, we can't have less land. So a land value tax kind of really encourages people to develop their land. That's why Henry George liked it. Anyway, though, their disagreement there seemed to be about this particular Academic Wealth Tax Commission report. So I went and looked up that report. So it was published in 2020 by an economist and 2 legal academics. To much fanfare, it got lots of sort of official funding. And confusingly, both Dan Neidle and Gary Stevenson can claim to be in part right. So the foreword to the report is written by Gus O'Donnell, who is a former head of the civil service. So Gus O'Donnell wrote in the introduction, "This report will not change everyone's mind, but I welcome it as an important contribution to the debate. It has been led by a team with the essential mix of skills in economics, tax law and administration who approach the subject with an open mind. They conclude that an annual wealth tax is a non-starter in the UK and we should fix our existing taxes on wealth instead. However, a one-off wealth tax is a very different proposition. They think it would work and could raise £250 billion over 5 years. This is a striking conclusion and it comes at a crucial juncture." Now, the context here, by the way, is that they thought a one-off wealth tax, this was obviously published sort of during COVID, and I think the argument was that loads of money has been spent by the government and we could sort of plausibly say this is a national emergency, we're going to do this one-off wealth tax, and that wouldn't change really people's behaviour. They wouldn't be able to try and move their wealth out of the country because you backdate it and you say this is only happening once, so you've got no reason to leave Britain. So you're trying to sort of reduce the incentive to flee with your wealth by just doing it once, but they thought you could make a lot of money doing this. That's just the context. However, the actual report does really back up what Gary is saying, right? So they argue that it's not going to make that much money, an annual wealth tax, but for other reasons you might want it. So this is from that report. If the only goal of an annual, so this is not from the foreword, this is from the actual authors of the report. If the only goal of an annual wealth tax is to raise relatively more tax revenue from people with wealth, this does not necessarily require a new wealth tax. Existing wealth taxes could simply be adjusted, and this would bring in more revenue from people with wealth. If the goals include actively reducing wealth concentration rather than merely raising necessary revenue from those with wealth, a wealth tax with a high rate could achieve this, but only if avoidance behaviours could be minimised. So exactly what Gary's saying, right? If your aim is not necessarily to raise revenue, but to reduce inequality, then as long as you do it right, an annual wealth tax could be justified. Elsewhere, they say this, an annual wealth tax would only be justified in addition to these reforms to existing wealth taxes if the aim was specifically to reduce inequality by redistributing wealth. We do not take any position on whether the government should use tax policy actively to reduce wealth inequality. So basically, Dan Neidle wasn't misquoting the foreword, but Gary Stevenson can point to this document, which Dan Neidle said is the best research ever done on this, and say, well, my argument has been specifically we should tax wealth not necessarily to raise revenue. It doesn't seem like it is a great revenue raiser, actually, but to reduce inequality. And this report says if you want to reduce inequality, then maybe the wealth tax is a good idea. Ash, I've seen so many people share that, saying Gary Stevenson got completely owned. I can't believe they let this go out in the documentary. Like loads of reviews, The Guardian, The Times, they're all just saying Gary Stevenson got completely owned. And that basically he's just a campaigner. But Dan Neidle kind of said, this is populist claptrap. And then sort of ignored the quote from the document. I'd actually quite like to watch like an hour-long debate between the two, because I do think Dan Neidle and Gary Stevenson have different strengths. Like Gary Stevenson, brilliant sort of analyst of the economy, but he's not a specialist when it comes to sort of tax law. Dan Neidle is. I think they could have a very productive conversation, but for me, that wasn't it.
So I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be an expert on tax, Michael, but you know what I am an expert in? Vibes. And how it came across to me was that Dan Neidle objects to Gary Stevenson as a political figure. And I think that he has an objection to Gary Stevenson and thinks that he's a populist rabble-rouser, maybe, doesn't like his proximity to, the sort of radical left or the movement left. It's also worth pointing out that Dan Neidle stood as a Labour First candidate for the Labour Party NEC. So he himself has, a bit of a political origin story. He was the sort of main driver behind that look into Zach Polanski's council tax status, despite not understanding the sort of ambiguity around,
houseboats,
marinas and houseboats and that kind of stuff. So it sounded to me, and from watching it, it seemed like they weren't really... that Gary Stevenson came in wanting to have a debate about a wealth tax, and Dan Neidle came in wanting to discredit Gary Stevenson as a political public figure. And so that way of expressing yourself, saying, well, in the foreword it says this, Stevenson was right. Well, in the report it says a lot of other things. And so what's going to be more important? The contents of the report, which have multiple authors, or the foreword, which is written by a single individual, right? Like, how are you going to balance these things? But Dan Neidle just kept on driving, and it seemed that there was a sort of crescendo that he wanted to get to, which is you're talking nonsense and you don't know what you're talking about, right? And there's this accusation of, it doesn't really seem like you've really thought about it. So to me, how it comes across is that Dan Neidle, and I think, this is what political operators do, right? Like politics is fundamentally about conflict. I would do the same thing if I was him. Dan Neidle had, in a sense, one eye on the clip, one eye on the edit, knowing that heat makes good TV, right? People love those clips where it's X destroys Y. We know that. We love those clips. And that there is a way to sort of humiliate, really, or to sort of harm the reputation of someone by basically being quite aggressive in your posture. I'm not saying aggressive like violent or aggressive like threatening, but just being, quite, I'm not going to back down on a single point here. And I think Gary Stevenson went in looking for a conversation. So there were two people with mismatch aims, right? Misalignment in what they were going in for. And I suppose if I were Gary Stevenson, I'd walk away from that being like, oh shit. It's not that I should have prepped on the facts, because he was prepped on the facts. It was that he should have been more prepared for, I guess, the political purpose that Dan Neidle, I think, had going into that conversation.
I mean, if we want to be really wonky, we could actually, because it's interesting, the difference between the forward and the report. And I think this probably gets to why there is lots of difficulty in introducing a wealth tax. I mean, obviously, as Gary talks about, you're going to get lots of rich people campaigning against it. But from the perspective of a civil servant and someone in the Treasury, so Lord Gus O'Donnell, who wrote the forward saying it's a non-starter, he's a former chief of the civil service. So he cares about what civil servants care about, what the Treasury cares about. And if you're in the Treasury and you're told, well, there's this tax, which is going to be quite difficult to implement, it's going to be quite politically difficult, and it's actually not going to raise you that much revenue, you're going to say, F off, right? Because your job as a civil servant is to try and maximize the revenue you get so that you can afford to spend things on stuff, right? Whereas Gary is interested in the distribution of power in the country. And the economists and the sort of legal experts who've written the report have said, we're actually neutral, really, about the distribution of power. If what you care about is the distribution of power in the country, then maybe the annual wealth tax is a good idea. If what you want to do is raise money in the simplest way of people with wealth, it's not the best idea. And if you're a civil servant, you're saying, okay, well, let's not effing do it then. But so I think there's potentially sort of an interesting tension between the civil servant and the economists, and we'll see how that plays out in the Andy Burnham government. Let's move on to a different point. So later in the clip, we showed you half the clip that was shared by Samuel Leeds. You can look up the second half yourself or watch the whole documentary, because in that, this is the part where Daniel Neidle sort of says, Gary's not an economist. He's never thought about how a wealth tax could encourage the wealthy to leave. He doesn't really back that up, but it wasn't particularly productive. It was a bit like the last clip. So instead, I wanted to show you that question coming up in a less heated exchange on Newsnight.
What we do in medicine is compare outcomes for patients. And wealth tax has been trialled in other countries with other financial patients. And in fact, only 3 blanket wealth taxes remain in Europe, in Spain, Norway and Switzerland, because a lot of economists say what actually happens is that the wealthy just switch jurisdictions. So why aren't you persuaded by the fact that they've been reversed in some jurisdictions?
But I'll tell you why wealth taxes get reversed, because basically all of the richest and most powerful people in the world don't want wealth taxes, and they push aggressively hard for them to get reversed, and they influence politicians and they get the wealth taxes reversed.
But in your documentary...
Have they failed in Norway and Switzerland? Norway and Switzerland, are they weak economies? Are these economies that are collapsing?
Well, I suppose the thing is, when you look at it, we say France ran a broad wealth tax, and it was replaced by a narrower property-only levy. So they did try your system, or a system like it, and then they tweaked it.
Well, the French wealth tax, like most attempts at wealth tax, was filled with loopholes. Wealth taxes, if they're brought in, the rich will lobby very hard to get loopholes put in. And we need to make sure that doesn't happen.
Because what happened in Norway, you asked me about Norway, is that it introduced an exit tax because the number of rich people leaving the country doubled after it increased its wealth tax in 2022. So you can see that introduction is followed by reaction.
Yeah. So let's bring in an exit tax.
So do you want both now?
I think you need an exit tax. I think an exit tax is just a basic way of defending the wealth in your economy. If you don't have an exit tax, then you are totally in the mercy of the rich at all points.
So, I mean, he has thought about what happens if the rich people go away, which is you have an exit tax. And by the way, that's not most people, even sort of wonky Dan Neidle types, if they talk about wealth, they say you can only have a wealth tax if you have an exit tax. So let's do the wealth tax and the exit tax. Now, the argument against it is that means that people will be less likely to sort of come to Britain and invest when they could do it elsewhere. Obviously, we don't really want people to come here and invest in our already existing housing. There's no point in that. That doesn't help us. But if they come in and invest in businesses, then obviously there is some benefit to that. I suppose, sort of from this discussion we just had, the critique, which I think would maybe be valid, is that Gary's wearing a tax wealth not work t-shirt. And if the argument is that a wealth tax isn't actually going to raise much revenue, but it'd be good because it will reduce inequality and be good for the balance of power, it's not going to replace taxing work. You are going to have to do both, right? So maybe it is too easy to say tax wealth not work.
Well, look, I think tax wealth not work is a slogan which is pointing out that, where the tax burden is falling is on people who are also being crushed by, utility bills and rent and mortgage interest rates and so on and so forth. And this is a point that you've made a million times, which is the more work you put in for your money, the more you seem to get taxed on it. So wages get taxed at a higher rate than investments, which get taxed at a higher rate than inheritances. So, I think that's just speaking to that idea. I think that people do need to be honest about why they support a wealth tax. So I support a wealth tax, and I often make the case for a wealth tax through the lens of here's the revenue it brings to the Treasury. But the real honest answer is that it's to do with concentrations of wealth and what they do to a society, right? All the things that it locks people out of, all of the things that it locks people into. So it locks people out of property ownership for themselves, locks them into, a rentier economy where they're just being squeezed for everything that they've got. And it also has this warping, distorting effect on democracy and political practices. And so from a political philosophical point of view, as well as a sort of, this is good for the Treasury, I support a wealth tax. And I suspect that Gary Stevenson sort of falls into the same camp. And so I think that this is where the sort of public-facing communications needs to just be expanded that little bit, which is talk about it in terms of revenue, talk about it in terms of how you'd make it work as a policy with exit taxes. And also, this third thing is make a political case based on what kind of society do you want to live in.
Yeah, I just mean because the revenue, I do think the revenue is not going to be insignificant, but I do think one of the reasons the Treasury isn't implementing it is because they think the revenue, there is a bit of a risk introducing any new tax and the revenue won't be amazing compared to other things. So I do, obviously you can make the argument based on revenue, but basically I want a wealth tax. I think Gary Stevenson is fantastic. I do think that single-handedly he has put this on the agenda, and that is all for the better. Whatever the technical difficulties, the fact that we're debating how to do it, I think is brilliant. My one problem, I suppose, with part of this discourse is when people think the wealth tax is the answer to every problem.
It's obviously not. It's obviously not.
So we don't have to worry about spending on this or that because just tax wealth. We can't increase this tax. We can't increase income tax because just tax wealth. It's it's actually not going to do as much as you hope it will do.
And I think this is the thing, right? Which is tax wealth not work is a riposte to the imbalance of taxation in the country that we have. But if you look at Scandinavian countries, which are often cited by the left as we want to be more like this, it's got actually higher rates of income tax than we have here.
On middle class. On middle class and working class people.
On middle class and working class people. What you have that counteracts that is a higher level of sort of public provision, like what it is that the state does and what you can expect from public life is a lot higher. But you do have wages of middle class and working class people being taxed a lot more. And I think it's fine to have that discussion. And I just think on that point about Gary Stevenson being such an effective communicator, that's why there's been this full court press on saying he did a shit job at the documentary, because it's about attacking your opponents where they're strong, not where they're weak. So rather than going, oh, Gary Stevenson, he's wearing shorts on Newsnight and his knees are really bony, right? Like instead it's about this thing which we know to be the sort of core of his appeal, which is that he's a very, very good communicator. He's saying, well, he's actually really shit at that. Look, he did this thing of like public-facing comms and it was really, really shit. It's the same way that, to go for Jeremy Corbyn, you attack his record as an anti-racist, right? Like the stuff about being scruffy and riding a bike, right? No one really cares. So you attack where they're strong to be able to discredit your opponent's strengths, because that's so much more effective than going for your opponent where they're weak.
I don't need to tell you this because I think almost 100,000 people have already watched it in 24 hours. But there is on our YouTube channel a very long interview with Aaron and Gary Stevenson, which was released on Sunday, which you must go watch if you haven't already. For now, let's wrap up. Ash, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
It's so warm in here.
So warm in here.
It's so warm in here. The back of my neck is slick.
There is, though, you'll be pleased to know, a new air conditioning unit which has just been delivered today, which is not yet plugged in because apparently we have to let some chemicals settle. I don't understand, but that's what I've been told. So hopefully, Alex, will it be plugged in tomorrow? It will be plugged in tomorrow.
What good is that to me? I'm not in tomorrow. I was in today. And let me just tell you what happened this morning, right? We have a video team meeting on Monday morning, and I was assured by Alex that there would be a new AC today. And I walked in and it wasn't plugged in because the chemicals have to settle, right? Why not give me Tuesday's show? Give me Tuesday's show.
I'm going to be hosting tomorrow. I've switched. Aaron's going to be hosting on Friday. I'm going to be hosting tomorrow. So see you then. Hopefully it'll be a little cooler in here. Hopefully you're keeping yourselves cool too. Thank you for watching. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.